Hey everyone. So today we are going to talk about the endocrine system. We've spent the past several videos talking about the nervous system, which is um, the primary control system for our body. We have a secondary control system called the endocrine system. Um, and this system is comprised of all of the glands in our body, all of the endocrine glands in our body that release hormone. There are also a lot of endocrine tissues scattered throughout our body that release hormone. We're going to take a somewhat surface level view and just look at some of the major glands and the major hormones and talk about some of the primary functions of this system. So the first thing we will talk about is, well, why do we have two systems? And what are the differences between the two systems in terms of regulating body processes? Well, the nervous system uses electrical messages. There's still chemical neurotransmitter, so it's kind of a neurochemical combo, but we utilize electrical currents to transmit signals very quickly over, a fairly large distance. If we step on a nail, that feeling of pain is transmitted very quickly to our central nervous system, and a response to reflexively pick our foot up off of the nail is back to the muscles, in less than a second. So it's very fast. That's because of electrical messages. The endocrine system uses chemical messages, and there's pros to cons to that. I guess it's not even really a con because we have the nervous system for this, but the con is that it's much slower. So if a chemical is released into blood, it could take some time for that chemical to reach the desired target cells. So it's slower. But there's some pros to that too. You can have a much broader effect. And that leads me into this next bullet point here, localized versus systemic effects. So the nervous system is really good at local, targeted control. So, wiggle my finger, perceive where this signal is coming from specifically. This nail is right, or thumbtack or whatever. That all sounds morbid, so I don't like to think about it, but I stepped on a thumbtack and it's, on the right side of my right foot. It's specific, it's local. The endocrine system is systemic. If a hormone is released into the blood, there's no way to control where that hormone goes. It's going to go everywhere that blood goes. And then beyond that, it's going to go everywhere that it can diffuse out of the blood into. So it's more systemic. And then lastly, we have this idea of lag period and effect time. So the nervous system has a very short lag period. When you decide that you are going to wiggle your index finger, it happens, as far as you can tell, instantaneously. When your body decides to increase glucose permeability in your muscle cells by releasing insulin, that takes a little bit longer. That could take a few minutes. So that's a lag period. And then conversely, effect time is the opposite. I apologize, it's the same. The nervous system has a very short effect time. The effect is present as long as the stimulus is present. So as long as I'm telling my index finger to wiggle, it will do so. But as soon as I remove the stimulus, it stops. It's a very short effect time. I can release hormone into my blood, and that hormone will remain in my blood for some time, depending on the half-life of the hormone. So that's a much longer effect time for the endocrine system. So the endocrine system, because of that long effect time and lag time, kind of lends itself towards processes that take place over hours, days, weeks, years, not things that need to happen in seconds. So reproduction, growth and development, electrolyte, water, nutrient balance of your blood, metabolism regulation, and some immune functions are all really well served by the endocrine system, well regulated by the endocrine system versus the nervous system, although the nervous system is involved in these as well. So let's talk a little bit about exocrine glands and endocrine glands. I think we already did last quarter in tissues. I told this story. I apologize, I'm going to tell it again. But basically, exocrine glands, they have a duct, which think of that as basically like a tube that takes whatever the gland is producing, whatever substance, and it provides a way for that substance to get out of the body. Out of the body means something very specific, though. It doesn't necessarily mean like onto the skin, although that would be an exocrine gland, like a sweat gland or an oil gland, sebaceous oil gland, that releases sebum or sweat onto the skin. That would be an exocrine gland. But you might have a unicellular goblet cell that releases mucin into the lining of your digestive tract or your lungs. That is also an exocrine gland because it's releasing something out of your body. And you may say, hold on a second, inside my stomach, that's in my body. Technically, by the anatomical definition, no, it isn't, because your stomach and your whole digestive tract is a tube that runs through your body. It's not inside your body. In order to be inside your body, or to be considered inside your body, this substance would need to be released into a fluid-filled internal compartment, like that is continuous or connected to your circulatory system, like the interstitial and intracellular fluids. Basically, that's it, extracellular, intracellular, and interstitial fluids. Those are all fluid compartments within your body. So once something is absorbed by the microvilli in your small intestine, now it's in your body. But once it's in your small intestine, it's technically outside of your body. So the example I gave last quarter, I think, was this trip I went on with my friends in college, and I'm kind of claustrophobic, and even more so if water is involved. And so where I went to school, there was a lot of like swimming holes and rivers and waterfalls and that kind of stuff. So we drove up into the mountains, and there's this place called the Flumes, and it was an old abandoned like man-made river that you could float for like hours. You could basically float all the way down the Sierras on a tube if you wanted, although then you'd have to walk back up and get your car. So there was a limit. And this was this man-made system for getting logs down the mountain. And so this little, maybe 4 foot wide, 6 foot wide river, I'm doing air quotes, would go over bridges, over canyons, these little rickety metal bridges. It would go through mountains. And so that's basically why the story is relevant, is that we floated into the mountain inside of a tunnel, and I had multiple panic attacks. I survived. That's not the point of the story. But actually, real quick about this story, it was terrifying. The roof of this tunnel was 6 inches from my face. So you're laying down on your back and you can't see a thing. If you held your hand in front of your face, you couldn't see it. And then you realize, if there's a grate at the end of this tunnel, I'm done. No one's ever going to find me. So I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I knew people had done it before, so logically I knew it was okay, but once you're inside there, the claustrophobia kicks in. Anyway, my point of all this is, was I in the mountain or was I in atmosphere? And I was breathing air. So even though I'm at the center of this mountain in a hollow tube, I'm not in the mountain. I'm not breathing dirt. I'm not buried alive. I'm breathing air. So I'm technically still outside of the mountain. So that's this example of our digestive tract running through our body. It's a tube through our body. It's still considered exocrine if something releases a substance into your digestive tract or into your lungs, versus endocrine, which is what we're going to be talking about the rest of the lecture. These are glands or tissues or cells that are releasing a hormone, which is for now all we know is just a chemical, into one of those fluid compartments. So it could be the blood, it could be interstitial fluid, extracellular fluid, same thing. Okay. So what are some glands? So we have the pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid glands, adrenal, pineal. There are more thymus. Pancreas is a mix of, exocrine and endocrine glandular tissue. We have the hypothalamus, which is a neuroendocrine organ. And then we have tissues that have endocrine function that aren't technically endocrine glands, like fat. Fat releases a lot of different hormones. Thymus, which I think we already mentioned above, intestinal endocrine tissues. So the thymus is really cool. I'm actually, one of my research proposals that I'm working on has to do with the thymus. The thymus is this gland. It sits kind of up above your heart, in between your sternum and your heart. Oh, there's a picture of it right there. And it starts to go away once you hit puberty. It's this process called thymic involution. It starts to deteriorate. And by the time you're 65, it's basically gone. It's still there, you can still see it, but it's made of fat. All of the functional tissue has been replaced by fat. And there's a bunch of research right now into how to slow that process down or even reverse it, because that is linked to cancer and increased susceptibility to infectious disease. It's this process called immunosenescence, and it's primarily due to your thymus involuting. And there's some really cool studies right now. A bunch of researchers who are interested in aging and immunology, looking at ways to slow that process down. Fahey, F-A-H-Y is a big one. Sinclair is another one. Anyway, if you ever get you'd have to be super bored, but if you ever get super bored, you can type thymic involution into Google Scholar and see what you can find. Okay, sorry, got distracted. So back to the endocrine system. So we have three different types of chemical messengers: hormones, autocrines, and paracrines. This could be the same chemical theoretically. The idea is that it depends on where the chemical is going. Okay, so let's do autocrines first. So an autocrine, the target sites for that chemical that's being released from the cell could very well be on the same cell. Paracrines are chemical messengers that go between cells of the same tissue. So autocrine is same cell, paracrine is nearby adjacent cells within the same tissue. A hormone is released into the circulatory system. And that could be released into the extracellular fluid, and then it diffuses into the circulatory system. It could be released directly into the circulatory system. The point is that hormone is released and circulated around the body. So anywhere that has a blood supply will be exposed to this hormone. So all the glands and tissues and chemicals we're going to be talking about either are hormones or glands that can release hormone. So let's start looking at some of those. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the categories first. So there are two types. Hormones can either be made of amino acids, and that would be an amine hormone, an amine hormone. And there can be different types of amino acid-based hormone. There can be very simple ones, amines. There can be peptides, which is a combination of several amino acids, and then you can have a protein hormone, which is a more complex amino acid-based hormone, like human growth hormone, which actually has a lot to do with thymic involution. That's the main, one of the main therapies for reversing thymic involution is human growth hormone administration. The problem is there's all kinds of side effects with administering human growth hormone. So one of the research proposals I'm looking at is looking at non-pharmaceutical ways to increase endogenous human growth hormone release to kind of get some of the similar benefits without the risks. Wow, I just can't help it get sidetracked. I'm sorry. So anyways, if something is composed of amino acids, it's an amino acid based hormone, and there are different types. And then the second category are steroid hormones. So these are lipid-soluble hormones that are typically much simpler. Although amine hormones are very simple, so that's a generalization I probably shouldn't make. But you can see they're fairly small. Like here's testosterone, relatively small lipid-soluble hormone. These can pass easily into cells because they're lipid-based, unlike amino acid-based hormones, which can't pass easily into cells because they're polar and some are quite large. So that's a big difference there. And I think that's actually going to bring us into, oh no, sorry. So we're going to talk a lot more about the differences between these two a little bit later. First, let's look at mechanisms of hormone action. So let's say a hormone is released. Like let's talk about one we haven't talked about, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Well, that hormone is released into circulation, but you can tell by the name it's designed to affect the adrenal cortex, right? Adrenocorticotropic. So how does it know which cells to stimulate if it's released into circulation? Well, every hormone has target cells, and target cells are simply cells that have a receptor for that hormone. So just because a hormone's released into circulation doesn't mean it's going to affect every cell. It's only going to affect cells with receptors. Anyway, the response to that could be one of many different things. It could cause a change in membrane permeability. So insulin is a great example. Insulin changes glucose permeability in skeletal muscle. It causes your skeletal muscle to absorb glucose out of your blood, basically. Glucagon would do the opposite. Or it could change membrane potential. So it could have an effect on neurons or muscle cells. It could stimulate protein production. That's a common one. It could activate or deactivate an enzyme. It could cause secretion. It could stimulate mitosis. If you think about human growth hormone, there's a lot of places where it might stimulate mitosis to cause growth. So it just depends. Every hormone works a little bit differently. So along that same train of thought, let's look at the mechanism of action for the two different categories of hormones, and basically how do they exert or affect a change in a cell. It's very different for the two, and there's a lot of good quiz and test questions here. So, sorry, smacking my lips. Sorry. So water-soluble hormones. What are those? Well, those are amino acid-based hormones, protein hormones. They're composed of amino acids, and therefore they are polar. And if you remember from last quarter, if you were here last quarter, polar compounds cannot pass through the cell membrane because they have a charge gradient, and therefore they're repelled by the lipid core of the cell membrane. So you don't need to know all those details necessarily, but just know that water-soluble hormones, protein hormones, amino acid hormones, cannot just float into the cell. In fact, they don't actually enter the cell at all. I mean, theoretically, it'd be possible to have some type of pump or channel or something, but they don't. Instead, they use something called a second messenger system. And I believe we have a slide for that, so I'll leave it at that. Lipid-soluble hormones, however, they can float right in because, again, they are lipid-soluble, they're non-polar, so they can just diffuse into the cell, and their receptor will actually be inside the cell. It might be in the cytosol, in which case it would bind with the receptor in the cytosol and then float into the nucleus, or the receptor might be in the nucleus and it would just go directly into the nucleus. So let's look at the second messenger system. Oh, you know what? This isn't exactly what I was expecting. So let me talk about it here a little bit first. So basically, we're talking about water-soluble hormone pathways or non-steroid hormones or amino acid hormones. Basically what happens is they bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. So you can imagine a test question. Where is the receptor? Where are amino acid-based hormone receptors located? A, within the cytosol, or nucleus, or B, on the surface of the cell membrane? And you would say on the surface of the cell membrane, because again, they can't get in, so the receptor has to be on the cell membrane. Anyway, it binds to the receptor, and then that receptor starts a cascade of chemical activity that we call a second messenger system. And basically all that means is the binding of this hormone triggers the production of some other second messenger that exerts the hormone's effects. It's like a baton. The hormone binds to the receptor, and then that receptor hands the baton off to a secondary messenger, which will carry out the effect. And so this is one example of a very common second messenger system. I used to be so much more uptight and ask for you guys to memorize all these things. I don't think that's necessary, but let's just run through it. So it's called the cyclic AMP mechanism, and this is a common second messenger system. So basically, the first messenger is the hormone. So the hormone binds to the receptor. Insulin would be a decent, oh no, insulin doesn't. Anyway, okay, sorry. Let's just forget about examples. So the hormone binds to the receptor activates a G protein. The G protein then, I thought I had a picture of this, I'm sorry, but the G protein then will move away from the receptor and bind to and activate something called adenylate cyclase, which is an enzyme, in the receptor, in the plasma membrane. So adenylate cyclase then will convert ATP to cyclic AMP, so it's basically, it removes two phosphate groups. So ATP is converted to AMP, adenosine monophosphate. AMP is the second messenger. So it's actually AMP then that goes and activates whatever we're trying to activate. In this case, enzymes, protein kinases, to exert its effects. That's just one. There are many of those. The take home for the quiz or the test is just that water-soluble hormones utilize second messenger systems. Their receptors are located on the surface of the cell membrane. So what the hormone has to do is bind to the receptor. The receptor then activates a second messenger. It's like a relay race. And then contrast that with direct gene activation, which again, I thought I had a photo here. Let's go back up again. So contrast that with direct gene activation, which is the pathway that lipid-soluble hormones utilize, steroids. So they can float right in, bind to a receptor. That receptor moves into the nucleus, and then that steroid receptor complex activates the transcription of messenger RNA. So it actually activates a specific gene within your DNA. That mRNA is then released or travels out of the nucleus, where it is translated into some type of amino acid, peptide, protein. So it actually, a steroid hormone actually activates a gene and leads to the production of a protein of some kind. And that's just dependent on the hormone and the target cell, in terms of what type of protein's created. Anyway, so for a hormone to do this, or to follow one of those pathways and exert its effects, the cell must have a hormone-specific receptor. So I mentioned adrenocorticotropic hormone earlier. So this bullet point is reminding you to mention two hormones because they're very different. One is called thyroxine, or thyroid hormone, and one is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Both of these hormones are released into the same system. They're released into the circulatory system. So they're going to come into contact with every cell in the body that has a blood supply. Adrenocorticotropic hormone will only stimulate cells, it will only bind to certain cells within the adrenal cortex because they have receptors for it. Thyroxine will bind to and exert its effects on almost every cell in the body because almost every cell in the body has thyroxine receptors. So it's the same mechanism for transport, right? The hormone's released into the blood goes all over the body, The difference is one has a lot of target cells and one has very few. So the cell must have hormone-specific receptors to be affected by the hormone. And then anyway, so the response to that hormone then is going to be based on three things. Blood level of the hormone, so how much is released, that's kind of obvious, right? What is the concentration of the hormone? You'll get more of an effect if there's more hormone and vice versa. And then what is the relative number of receptors? That's not just in terms of the number of target cells, but how many receptors are on each cell. And that can change, which we'll talk about on that very last bullet point. And then what is the affinity between the receptor and the hormone? Some receptors don't have as much affinity to a hormone, so it takes more of a hormone to elicit an effect. This last bullet point, upregulation versus downregulation. So this is in relation to number 2. What is the number of receptors? That's not a fixed thing. That can change. There's actually a disease that is really 100% due to downregulation. So I'm going to slow down and talk about this a little bit. So basically, type 2 diabetes is an example of this. So I don't know if you guys know the differences between type 1 and type 2, but basically type 1 diabetes are insulin dependent because the alpha and beta cells in the pancreas have been damaged. And there's a lot of different theories as to why that happens, which has actually changed dramatically in the past 10 years. There's some thoughts that it's purely environmental. There's some thoughts that it's a virus that damages the cells. There's some thoughts that it's autoimmune. So it's not really pinned down. We just know that it's your body stops producing insulin and some other hormones. So then you need to start taking it. Type 2 diabetes has the same end result, but it has a completely different cause and mechanism. So basically, let's say, let's just pretend, we'll just use me as an example. So I'm married, right? So the incentive to stay away from donuts has diminished precipitously, right? Donuts, chips, pasta, all the good stuff, right? All the stuff you want to eat, but you try not to. So let's just say I throw all caution to the wind and I'm eating lots of bread, lots of pasta, lots of whatever, okay? Anyway, so how does my body respond to that? So my body senses all this increased glucose, and in response, it releases insulin. So insulin binds to receptors all over your bodies, especially in muscle cells, and it increases membrane permeability to glucose. So sugar is absorbed. Glucose is absorbed by your skeletal muscle. So your blood sugar drops. But let's say you keep this up. This becomes a lifestyle change. I'm saying you, it's about me. Sorry, I forgot. So let's say I keep this up. So my diet now consists primarily of carbohydrates, let's say, in excessive amounts. And not even probably the good kinds. It's even deteriorating further where it's refined, processed, simple sugars. And so all of a sudden now not only do I have a lot of glucose in my blood all the time, but I have a lot of insulin. So there's always a high amount of insulin in my body at all times, dealing with all this sugar. Well, my cells start to think something's wrong. And there's a chemical mechanism behind this. They don't have independent thought, but for simplicity's sake, they start to sense that something is wrong, and they don't understand why there's so much insulin around all the time. So they say, okay, there's clearly some kind of something is wrong. The body's making too much insulin, and in order to stop something bad from happening, we're going to downregulate the number of insulin receptors. So your cells start to destroy insulin receptors. Well, now all of a sudden your glucose is elevated because you're still eating the same amount of sugar every day, but the insulin is losing effectiveness because there's less receptors. So how does your pancreas respond? It releases more insulin. And you can see the start of a vicious cycle, right? So now we're releasing even more insulin. And the cells respond by destroying even more insulin receptors. And the pancreas responds by producing even more insulin. Pretty soon, the sensitivity to that insulin is so low that you are now diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic because your blood sugars are high all the time, abnormally so. And so there's different drugs you take, and you address the underlying cause, which is the diet, and you exercise more, and it's reversible. So the difference then between type 1 and type 2 is type 2 diabetics have plenty of insulin. It's just not effective. Type 1 diabetics cannot make insulin because cells are actually destroyed in the pancreas that do so. Anyway, so that is an example of downregulation. The opposite would happen if you all of a sudden stopped eating as much sugary stuff, as much sugary foods. And this is controversial, low carb diets, high carb diets. I'm not even going there. I'm just saying, so you just go back to a healthy, normal, diet. You stop eating the pasta and the cake and all that stuff. Anyway, so then your cells, you'll start to release less insulin. Your cells will start to upregulate, and eventually you can, over time, return to normal. So that's upregulation versus downregulation. Okay, so what controls hormone release? So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with a negative feedback loop versus a positive feedback loop, but hormones are regulated by a negative feedback loop. So what that means is insulin, again, is actually a great example. So say you eat, I just went camping, and it was nice to get out of the house. So I just went camping and made s'mores with my daughter for the first time. So we all had s'mores, which, does anybody like s'mores? They're not, I like force myself to eat it. I just want to eat the chocolate out of the inside and forget about the rest. But anyway, so you're eating a s'more. That means glucose is being absorbed by your body, and it happens quickly, like within minutes. Glucose actually starts to be absorbed in your mouth. Through the mucous membrane in your mouth, your glucose starts to elevate right away. It's very easy to absorb glucose. Anyway, so glucose goes up. That's the stimulus for insulin release. Insulin is released, glucose falls. Falling glucose levels is the trigger to stop releasing insulin. So that's a negative feedback loop. The release of insulin triggers the insulin release to end. Does that make sense? So it kind of causes its own, it's a negative feedback loop. So what's really cool for that is, you can regulate a process with one hormone almost in some cases. In the case of glucose, you do have two, but the point is it doesn't start this vicious cycle that a positive feedback loop would cause. So it's a very good way to regulate concentrations of something, is a negative feedback loop. So all the hormones we talked today are regulated by a negative feedback loop, but they may have different types of stimulus. So the first is a humoral stimulus. Humoral, so the word humor refers to like a fluid-filled space, like the fluid in your eye is called the aqueous humor. So a humoral stimuli refers to a concentration of something, of a solute within a solution. So most of the hormones we're going to talk about are stimulated to be released due to a humoral stimulus. So again, insulin is another good example. So glucose concentration change causes insulin release. Let's talk about calcium. If calcium levels fall, parathyroid hormone is released. Parathyroid hormone causes your bones to be broken down sounds so dramatic, but osteoclasts within your bone break down bone, releasing calcium into your blood. Okay, so calcium concentration change triggers parathyroid hormone release, another humoral stimulus. So you want to think of a changing concentration means humoral stimulus, and that's what you're going to see on the test. I may have said falling glucose earlier, I apologize, but glucose is rising, insulin is released. What type of stimulus is that? Humoral stimulus. Calcium is falling, parathyroid hormone is released. What type of stimulus is that? It's a humoral stimulus. I'll try to think of more examples as we go. There can be a neural stimulus. Not a ton of examples of this, but one very clear-cut one is the relationship between the adrenal medulla and the sympathetic nervous system. So if you guys remember, the sympathetic nervous system had a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron in all of its pathways. That is not true for one specific part of the sympathetic nervous system where you only have a preganglionic neuron. And that preganglionic neuron goes directly into the adrenal medulla, and it can stimulate adrenaline release, or epinephrine, same thing. I was listening to an interesting talk about why we have two names for the same thing, and apparently two labs discovered it at about the same time, and one wanted to call it epinephrine and one wanted to call it adrenaline, and so it's just been an ongoing now we have to say both every time, but they're synonyms, so epinephrine, adrenaline. Anyway, so that is a neural stimulus. The nervous system actually stimulates the release of a hormone called adrenaline. And that's never a good feeling, right? Yeah, maybe it can be a good feeling if you're an adrenaline junkie and you're into roller coasters and stuff, but that you don't want that adrenaline rush related to like work or school, right? That's stress, and that's bad. Then you can also have a hormonal stimulus. These are very common. So this is, anytime you see the word tropic or tropin, it means that it's a hormone that causes the release of another hormone. So when one hormone triggers the release of another hormone, that's a hormonal stimulus. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is an example. Thyroid stimulating hormone is an example. There's several. We'll actually talk about a few of them, I think, within the next slide or two. Nervous system modulation. So the nervous system can override or adjust endocrine system controls. Insulin is, again, an example. So the nervous system can actually trigger insulin to be less effective. It can trigger gluconeogenesis. Stress causes gluconeogenesis due to nervous system function and cortisol. There's all different kinds of ways the nervous system can modulate endocrine system controls. So far we've been kind of talking about the hormones in a vacuum, like each one does a specific thing. Well, we haven't even gotten into specifics yet, but there is some interaction between hormones at target cells. So one such interaction is called permissiveness. This means that one hormone actually permits another hormone to function more effectively or at all. Thyroxine is an example of a hormone that needs to be present for a lot of other hormones to work. That's just one example. Synergism is when two hormones do the same thing. They may do it in different ways, but they have the same net effect. Insulin and, glucagon and human growth hormone, for example, or cortisol and glucagon, both raise glucose. Human growth hormone and insulin can both lower it. I'm trying to think of some other examples. Anyway, let's go on to antagonism. So these are when two hormones have opposite effects. Insulin and glucagon is the best example. Insulin lowers blood glucose concentration, glucagon increases it. Different mechanisms. Insulin causes skeletal muscle to absorb glucose, thereby lowering blood glucose. Glucagon causes the liver to release glucose. It can cause proteins to be converted to glucose, but they have opposite effects on blood glucose, so they're antagonists. Okay, so now we're getting into some specifics. I'm I may take a break. No, I'm okay. Let's keep going. You can take a break though. Hit pause if you're falling asleep. So let's look at the pituitary gland now. So this used to be kind of called the master gland, but actually the hypothalamus really dictates what the pituitary gland does. But anyway, so there's two lobes, the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. And this is so weird because if you ever look at one of these in the anatomy lab, some summers, I did not enjoy this at all, but some summers we would have to take the skull caps off of the cadaver so we could look at the brain or take the brain out. And when you take the brain out, the pituitary gland always gets left behind. It sits within the sella turcica of the skull, if you remember that from last quarter, and this little stalk here called the infundibulum breaks oftentimes. Anyway, it just looks like this tiny little like pea almost, and actually it is two lobes. The posterior lobe isn't even a gland. It is all of the axon terminals from the hypothalamus, or from two nuclei within the hypothalamus. So you have neurons coming down into the posterior pituitary, and then they can actually release neurotransmitter into the blood, which is super interesting because technically that's still a hormone, right? Because it's a chemical released into the blood that's a messenger, but it's not coming from a gland, it's coming from a neuron, so it's different. It's the only example of this, and we call that a neurohormone. So neurons are releasing neurotransmitter into the blood. So we don't call them neurotransmitters, we call it neurohormone. So it's technically not an endocrine gland, but it releases hormone, so neurohormone, so we include it. So that's a direct neural link between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland, in quotes. The anterior pituitary is an endocrine gland. It's composed of glandular tissue. It has a blood relationship with the hypothalamus. There's a portal system that allows chemical messages to move very quickly between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, but it is an actual gland. There's no neural connection. And it releases 6 hormones, which we will talk about soon. Here's a pic. This is a great picture of the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei releasing hormone, in quotes, sort of, directly into the capillary bed, where it goes into venous circulation and eventually into arterial systemic circulation. So this is interesting because oxytocin is a neurotransmitter. So it makes sense that it could be released by a neuron, but it has a completely different function in the blood as it does in the brain. So the supraoptic nucleus releases oxytocin into the blood. The paraventricular nucleus releases ADH. Very similar compounds, very different functions. So is this actually where I should talk about them? No, okay, it's coming up. So anyway, so they synthesize oxytocin, and antidiuretic hormone. Take a look at this infundibulum here, this stalk. I feel like I talked about this with you guys, type 3 diabetes insipidus, but anyway, it happens because this is severed, and you'll see why in a second, because it releases antidiuretic hormone. But let's talk about oxytocin first. So oxytocin stimulates uterine contraction and milk ejection. If you ever have a baby or your wife has a baby, there's a chance you may be prescribed oxytocin. They call it something else, like the drug name, the brand name, whoever makes it. I think it's Pitocin, but it's synthetic oxytocin. And so it stimulates uterine contraction. So what would be a good use for that clinically? To induce labor. So my wife has kind of a traumatic story about that. She was already in labor and they gave her oxytocin and it was like craziness. So they had to stop. So this role is misunderstood in males, obviously. So this same chemical though released in the brain makes you feel good. It's what you release. It's what your brain releases when you're cuddling with somebody. It's called the cuddle hormone. So two very different effects in the brain versus the blood. ADH, although chemically similar to oxytocin, is different and binds to different receptors, and its primary job is to anti-diuretic, which means anti-diuresis, which means urine formation. So it inhibits urine formation. It promotes water retention, which, I mean, it makes sense that we would have to have a chemical for this, right? Because if you didn't have a way to regulate urine production, you would need to be on an IV all day, getting a constant drip of water. That's obviously not going to work, right? So you need a way to drink a bunch of water and then, maybe produce some urine right as you drink that water, but then hold on to water for the 4 hours that you're not drinking water again. So it's a way to prevent wide swings in water balance. And we actually have a few hormones dedicated to this, different mechanisms. ADH targets kidney tubules and causes water to be reabsorbed before it can be, become urine. So you have hypothalamic osmoreceptors that are detecting what the osmolarity is of various solutes in your blood. And based on that, the hypothalamus is triggering the posterior pituitary to release ADH or to not release ADH. So pain, low blood pressure would be two things that would cause its release. Low blood pressure makes sense, right? Because if you have low fluid volume within your circulatory system, you don't want to be losing water through urine formation. Oftentimes, something you see all the time clinically is someone with a high heart rate and low blood pressure because they're dehydrated, right? So their heart's working so hard to keep that blood pressure up, and their blood pressure is like 100/60, and you might be tempted to say, oh, great, it's a great blood pressure. But if their pulse is 100 at rest, they're probably dehydrated. Morphine and barbiturates also affect ADH release. Real quick, I'm telling a lot of stories today. This is going to end up being long. I'm sorry, but I know I told you this already, and I don't know what the context was, and so I apologize for telling it again. Just skip like a minute. I think you can do that on YouTube, right? Skip 15 seconds at a time. So I was in Puerto Rico for a few months in school doing a clinical rotation down there. I think I told you the story about that guy who like traveled the world and stuff. Anyway, they had this stuff called Sazon, Sauzon, and it was in a lot of the food, and we would add it to food in little packets, and it made the food very orange and delicious. If you ever had, like, what's a good example? There's just certain foods that just taste like, I don't know. It has a name. It's called umami, I think. It's savory. That's the word I'm looking for. Very savory. Anyway, so I'm putting this stuff on everything, and oh my gosh, I'm surprised I didn't become type 2 diabetic when I was there because I was eating so much sugar. Everything is made out of plantains and chickpeas down there. It's delicious. I gained like 20 pounds. That reminds me of another funny story. But anyway, so I came back and we found that they had Sazon at Stater Brothers in Loma Linda. I couldn't believe it. So I bought a box and I'm like, what is Sazon? So I look at it, there's one ingredient. I'm sure most of you already know what it is. There's one ingredient in Sazon, and it's monosodium glutamate. And I'm like, monosodium glutamate, what's that? I'm like, sodium SG. Oh, it's just pure MSG. So I'm just putting packets of MSG in all my food. And so why is MSG bad? I'm sure most of you know that MSG is bad. It's a protein tenderizer. It denatures proteins, which is why it makes meat taste really good if you eat meat, or it just makes everything taste savory. And so a lot of people report feeling like brain fog after you eat it because it's tenderizing your neurons. Well, one set of neurons in particular that are particularly vulnerable to this meat tenderizer is this thin little stalk right here. So there's this disease called diabetes insipidus, and the primary cause is too much MSG consumption, I believe. And that can actually sever this connection between the paraventricular nucleus and your circulatory system, and you cannot release ADH. So what happens, the main symptoms are just excessive thirst and urination. So you're just drinking water all the time. You can never satisfy your thirst because you're urinating it out as soon as you drink it. So I stopped eating Cezone, but man, it's good. I thought MSG was like illegal. I didn't realize that that's not the case. People still use it. So anyway, if something tastes too good to be true, there might be some monosodium glutamate in it. Anyway, okay, where was I at? Here, okay, anterior pituitary. I have one more Puerto Rico story. I'm so sorry. It just made me laugh so much. They have mayo ketchup, they call it, and it is literally mayonnaise and ketchup. And I mean, here we would call that Thousand Island. I guess there's no relish. Anyway, so the whole time they're like, we've got to send you home with some mayo ketchup. And I was like, we have mayonnaise and ketchup in California. And they're like, oh, it's different. It's different. Anyway, at Stater Brothers, they had mayo ketchup, and it's literally just ketchup and mayonnaise. Anyway, I don't know why I think that's funny, but it cracked me up. Help me, guys. Where am I? Anterior pituitary. Okay, so I'll pick up the pace. I'm sorry. So anterior pituitary hormones. This is a endocrine gland. It's endocrine tissue, glandular tissue. It releases 6 amino acid protein-based hormones: TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone; adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. You can already tell that this is going to be a tropin, which means it triggers the release of another hormone because it's thyroid stimulating hormone. This one has the word tropic in it. Follicle stimulating hormone. So a lot of these hormones trigger hormone release. It says right here 4 of 6 are tropins. So I don't know if we're going to talk about all these, but let's see. So, okay, first one, growth hormone. So growth hormone is an anabolic hormone. Anabolic just refers to a state that your body can be in. Your body can be in an anabolic state or a catabolic state. And you can think of catabolic as breaking things down, and anabolic as building things up, whether that's fat or muscle. Anabolic you can think of meaning growth, and catabolic meaning breakdown. So its direct effect is actually on metabolism. It deals with, it causes anabolism, so it causes your muscles to absorb glucose, much like insulin, which can cause growth of your muscles indirectly. So its direct action is on metabolism, its indirect action is on growth. You release a lot more of this during puberty, and of course, once you're an adult, you start releasing less of this. It's actually a decline in this hormone that is linked to thymic involution, which is linked to immunosenescence, which is why elderly folks have a tendency to become sick more easily and are more likely to develop cancer. I hate to do another, it's not a story, but the reason that is that the thymus is where T cells mature. And cytotoxic T cells in particular are white blood cells, they're lymphocytes, that are capable of destroying your own cells, which doesn't sound like it would be a good thing, but it is. If a virus gets into a cell and turns that cell into a virus factory, you want a white blood cell that can destroy that cell. So that's a cytotoxic T cell or killer T cell or natural killer. You have a bunch of different cells that do this, but the cytotoxic T cell is the main one, and it can do the same thing for cancerous cells. So if a cell becomes cancerous, the cytotoxic T cell can get rid of it. So as you age, your ability to produce that special type of T cell goes away. You still hold on to all of your memory T cells, which help prevent you from getting sick again from something you've already been sick with or been vaccinated against. So that's good, but new infections or cancers, if you don't have those cytotoxic T cells, that's not good. So that happens because of thymic involution. Anyway, and human growth hormone plays a big role in that. But for our test, the main thing is just its direct action is on metabolism. Its indirect action is on growth. It promotes growth. It promotes an anabolic state. Thyroid stimulating hormone. This just stimulates thyroid development and secretion of thyroxine. Pretty straightforward. So TSH promotes thyroxine release, thyroid hormone release. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is another tropin that stimulates the release of corticosteroids by your adrenal cortex, the outer shell of your adrenal gland. A lot of different things are released by that little small patch of tissue that wraps the adrenal glands, cortisol being a big one. Gonadotropins, so this is FSH and LH, regulates function of gonads absent until puberty. So it regulates function and development of ovaries and testes. Prolactin is similar in structure to growth hormone, not in function. It stimulates milk production. Its role is not understood in males, but it is there. And it's controlled by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is just dopamine and estrogen. Okay, thyroid gland. So your thyroid gland, if you haven't been having a poor diet like me lately, you might actually be able to feel this. If you run your finger up and down the front of your neck, you might feel this little isthmus, like a little bump almost, in front of your trachea. It's a butterfly-shaped gland with this little connection, which they've labeled as the isthmus. Isthmus that's a geographical term. It just means like a thin patch of land with water on both sides. But they use it anatomically too, I guess. Anyway, you can feel that potentially. It is the largest pure endocrine gland. The pancreas is bigger, but the pancreas isn't purely endocrine. It releases fat emulsifiers into your stomach to break down fat, which is an exocrine function. But so thyroid is the largest endocrine gland, highly vascularized, and it produces thyroid hormone or thyroxine. It's the body's major metabolic hormone. So thyroxine, it promotes increased metabolism, increased aerobic respiration, increased ATP production. It's two different iodine-containing protein hormones, T3 and T4. T4 is what's released by the thyroid. It's converted to T3 at the target cells. Pretty much every cell that has a blood supply has thyroxine receptors. Okay, so what does thyroid hormone do? It increases your basal metabolic rate. It has a calorigenic effect. It increases your body's heat. It's responsible for maintaining your core temperature of 98.6 by increasing the calorigenic effect in your metabolic rate. It regulates tissue growth and development. So you won't grow and develop normally without thyroid hormone. And it increases adrenergic receptor concentration in blood vessels, which means it raises blood pressure. So this, you've probably heard of people who are hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. Both are bad. So some examples, you can kind of intuit what some effects might be. So if you're hypothyroid, you may be cold often. You actually tend to feel cold. I know it's, you think of, high temperature, you feel cold, but low temperature, you're going to feel cold as well. You may be overweight potentially, but not always. Lethargic is a big one. Hyperthyroidism, you may be underweight. You may have high blood pressure. Might be kind of restless. I knew a girl who had hyperthyroidism, and one of the things you notice with kind of more extreme hyperthyroidism is called Graves' effect, and it's when it's almost like her eyes were kind of protruding a little bit, Not so, that sounds like what? It's not that noticeable, but it was noticeable. And it actually has to do with the fat around the eye being consumed for metabolic purposes, because that's how much thyroid hormone was around. So it's kind of an interesting, but somewhat rare side effect of that. Um, I'm trying to think if there's any. No, we're good. Let's move on to parathyroid. So parathyroid, the name kind of gives it away where they're located. They're located near the thyroid gland. It's almost always drawn as three small little dots on the back of the thyroid. It's not always the case though. You could have less than four, you could have more than, you could have eight. They've been found on the lungs before, so they're not necessarily always like this, but that's kind of typical. They used to be removed back in kind of the dark ages of medicine, even way back before lobotomies were popular even. They used to think these are almost like little tumors. So they'd be removed with devastating effects because calcium concentration balance is key to staying alive, which is what these are for. So that's no good. Your heart won't work correctly, your neurons won't work correctly if your calcium levels are out of whack. Anyway, so what does parathyroid hormone do? Well, it regulates calcium concentration. We talked a lot about this in the bones chapter. It does so by stimulating osteoclast activity, osteoclast breakdown or inorganic bone matrix, and release calcium into the blood. So your bones are kind of like a calcium bank. Your body would much rather keep your heart and neurons working and sacrifice your bone density. So that can, if that happens over years and years and years, that can lead to osteopenia and osteoporosis. But for all of us, without osteopenia and osteoporosis, this is just a normal process. When calcium intake is high, you'll replenish it. When it's low, you'll pull it out, just like a bank. Although sometimes you withdraw too much, which is my case. I'm always withdrawing more than I'm depositing from my bank. Same can happen to your bones. So anyway, so parathyroid hormone fixes that by increasing osteoclast activity. It also increases calcium absorption by the kidneys and the intestine. I didn't put that there, and it promotes activation of vitamin D, which increases absorption of calcium by the intestine. That's why you hear about vitamin D a lot with calcium. This is a great example of a humoral stimulus, by the way. Calcium levels drop, parathyroid hormone is released. Okay, adrenal gland. So two very different parts to your adrenal gland, the cortex and the medulla. So let's look at the cortex first. There's actually a few layers to the cortex. The capsule, which doesn't release anything, and then the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and reticularis. And those all release a different set of corticosteroids. Three types: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids, these are kind of the big ones. Gonadocorticoids, they're very weak sex hormones, so we're not exactly sure why they're necessary because we have more and much stronger hormones released from other glands. But anyway, so let's keep going. Mineralocorticoids. These regulate electrolyte concentrations in extracellular fluids, which in turn is going to regulate water as well, because water follows solute. If you've ever ate a really salty meal, you feel bloated after because all of the fluid is pulled into your intestines and around your intestines and your stomach, so you feel bloated. Your stomach feels swollen if you eat a really salty meal. So mineralocorticoids regulate that electrolyte balance and, by extension, water balance. The main one released, the main mineralocorticoid, is aldosterone. So aldosterone influences blood volume and pressure. So I think I have a photo. Okay. So in response to blood pressure decline, specialized cells within the kidneys are excited. These cells release renin, into the blood, and then I'm going to walk you through this process on the next page. Renin converts angiotensinogen into, let's just go to the photo, it's easier. Okay, so you have these cells within your macula densa, and I love this word, juxtaglomerular cells. So these are cells next to the glomerulus. We'll talk about this when we get to the kidneys, but anyway, so the macula densa senses low fluid flow or low sodium concentration. Low sodium concentration is going to mean less water, right? So basically, the cells release renin. Renin reacts with angiotensinogen to form angiotensin 1. It's so cool, all of the reactions that happen in your lungs. This is one of them. So angiotensin 1 reacts with ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, within the lungs to form angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor. So right away you're going to have increased blood pressure already. But that's not all. So angiotensin 2 also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which is the mineralocorticoid that we're talking about. Aldosterone stimulates sodium uptake within the convoluted tubules, which causes water reabsorption. Similar to what ADH does. A different mechanism, but both cause increased water reabsorption. ADH causes the aquaporins to move, so these little pores that allow water through will move to the collecting duct plasma membrane, which increases water reabsorption. So they both increase water reabsorption, just slightly different mechanisms. So anyway, what do I want you to know? I want you to know that aldosterone increases water reabsorption, which increases fluid volume and blood pressure, or at least slows the decline in fluid volume and blood pressure, just like ADH. Glucocorticoids. Cortisol. Man, so much research about cortisol over the years, and it's almost even a resurgence again. We think of cortisol as being like the devil hormone. Like we try to do everything we can to reduce cortisol. So you may have heard of all of its bad effects, and that's true for sure, potentially, but it also keeps us alive. So it's not like this poison in our body. It's just that because we tend to be chronically stressed, we tend to have too much of this. So let's just kind of take the basic view first of why it's good. So it influences metabolism and helps the body resist stressors. And what it really does, in addition to that, is it helps the body adapt to intermittent food intake by keeping glucose levels fairly constant. So it's kind of like ADH in this sense, because we can't just be on an NG tube getting paste fed to us all day to keep our blood glucose level right at 90 or wherever we want it, right? We don't just have this steady drip of glucose. Not only do we eat intermittently, but we utilize glucose intermittently. If we're sitting down, resting, we need less. If we're sprinting up a mountain, we need more. So how do we deal with that if we don't have a constant intake of food? Well, we have a hormone called cortisol, which helps our body adapt to these circumstances by keeping glucose levels constant. There's a few different glucocorticoids. Cortisol is the primary active form. So what does cortisol do? It has secretory bursts driven by patterns of eating and activity that occur in a definite pattern throughout the day and night. So when would cortisol be low? Well, if you're eating a big meal, you probably don't need cortisol, because cortisol increases blood glucose levels. But if you haven't ate in a long time, you might want some cortisol because you haven't ate in a long time. So when's the time of day that you're most likely to have gone the longest without eating? Morning, because you went all night without eating. So levels of cortisol peak immediately prior to awakening. Lowest levels occur shortly before and after we fall asleep. You just had a big meal, dinner, and also you're asleep. So you're not consuming a lot of glucose. So that makes sense. Stress can interrupt these rhythms. Acute stress will cause cortisol bursts. That isn't necessarily bad. Acute stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you you know you decide you're going to go for a 5-mile run, that's acute stress to your body, right? So you're going to release cortisol to adapt to that stress. That's not necessarily bad. It's when you have chronic stress all the time, so you're just saturated with cortisol, irregardless of activity. That's not good, because what does cortisol do? Gluconeogenesis, which means glucose production, and it increases your blood pressure. So if you picture someone with a poor diet already, relatively inactive, and then they're stressed because they have a rough job or whatever, so now their body's making gluconeogenesis even when they're not eating poorly, right? So your body's producing blood sugar and increasing your blood pressure. So that is a pathway to type 2 diabetes and hypertension and heart issues. So anyway, okay, I think that's it for cortisol. Gonadocorticoids, these are weak male sex hormones, insignificant amount compared to what's made by the testes, so the purpose of them is not really that well understood. Adrenal medulla. So all of that stuff we just talked about was just in the outer layers of the adrenal gland. We still have the medulla. The medulla only releases two things, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are just two different forms of adrenaline, basically. And these are released in response to the sympathetic nervous system stimulation. So you're walking down a dark alley, somebody grabs you. In addition to spazzing out and slapping them away, you're going to have this crazy adrenaline rush. You all know what that feels like, that adrenaline rush. It can be good, it can be bad, it just depends on the situation. But what does it do? Well, adrenaline causes blood vessels to constrict. So if you picture all your blood vessels getting smaller, with a fixed amount of blood, your blood pressure is going to go up. And your heart rate is going to go up, which will increase blood pressure even further. So increased BP is the first thing. Blood is diverted away from non-essential organs. So you're not going to be sending a ton of blood to, I don't know, your spleen. You're diverting blood to your brain, to your skeletal muscles, organs designed to help you fight or flight. Your blood glucose levels will rise. Why? Well, you want to have fuel to draw on. You want to have glucose around if you need to run or fight or flight. So you want to have fuel in the tank, basically. Clinically, this can be used to increase heart rate, to dilate bronchioles during asthma attacks. But it's not all good, again, with chronic stress, with this constant sympathetic response all day in response to not real danger, right? It's not really helping you. Having like just this adrenaline stressed out over, reports that are due or meetings you have the next day, it's not really valuable to you, and actually chronically it's very bad for you. So the combination of this and cortisol together is what causes a lot of health issues. Pineal gland. A couple weeks ago, we were calling this the epithalamus. It's the same thing, the epithalamus and the pineal gland. So the endocrine function is somewhat of a mystery because it does release melatonin into the blood, although we don't necessarily know what the purpose is of that. We do know that melatonin makes you sleepy when it's released in your brain. And its release is regulated by visual pathways. So when your retina is taking in a lot of light, melatonin secretion is inhibited. When it gets dark out, melatonin release is kicked up a notch, which is the whole idea behind, why you shouldn't be looking at phones and computer screens late at night. It's 10:30 right now, and I'm staring at a big, 35-inch monitor here, blinding me. So I'm going to be up late probably. So anyway, melatonin, surprisingly, is an interesting supplement. and it's something I'm interested in, not from a sleep perspective, but it's one of like 5 or 6 things that you can see a dramatic, actually dramatic human growth hormone, endogenous human growth hormone release. So melatonin is one example. There are others. Arginine is an amino acid that you could take. Anyway, I don't remember if it was melatonin or arginine or something else, but I think it was melatonin. They saw a 400% increase in human growth hormone release after taking melatonin. It's short term, but human growth hormone endogenously has a pretty big half-life. So it was pretty significant. Anyway, so that may be one of the functions of melatonin released into the blood. But anyway, sorry for a quiz. It's regulated by visual pathways. It helps you sleep. Pancreas. Okay, the pancreas releases a ton of different hormones, but there's 2 major hormones, 2 primary hormones. And before I even get there, it is composed of both endocrine and exocrine gland cells. I don't know why I'm blanking on pancreatic lipase. There we go. So pancreatic lipase is a component of bile, and it's a fat emulsifier. So what that means is if you eat something fatty, your intestines don't really have the ability to absorb it unless it's broken down by a compound like pancreatic lipase. So there was this idea, I don't see it much anymore, but there was this idea that if you could somehow inhibit pancreatic lipase, your body would be unable to absorb the fat. So there was this drug, I don't even think it required a prescription. I think they sold it at Target. It was called Alli, A-L-L-I, and it inhibited pancreatic lipase production. So what would that do? Well, it'd cause your body to not absorb fat, so you'd lose weight. So it was like a weight loss thing. But can you guess what type of side effects that might have? I'm sure you've heard commercials like this. It may cause oily discharge, fat in your stool, foul smelling, whatever. So basically, if you don't absorb it, it comes out of you somewhere, right? So I don't see it much anymore. I think it was pretty brutal. But there are some more natural ways to do that. If you've ever heard of oolong tea inhibits pancreatic lipase production, not to such a dramatic and traumatic extent, just mildly. So if you're into that, you could drink some of that. Anyway, that's an exocrine function because that's something that's being released into the digestive tract, so outside of the body, technically. The endocrine function, you have 2 types of islet cells. So you have these cells that are called islet of Langerhans cells. A ton of research has gone into these guys. The alpha cells, so 2 different types. Alpha cells produce glucagon, which is a powerful hyperglycemic agent. What that means is it raises your blood glucose. And the beta cells produce insulin. If you're a type 1 diabetic, all of these have been damaged, as well as some cells that produce amylin, which is an appetite suppressant, and there's other hormones, but the one you really can't live without is insulin. Glucagon, not the end of the world. You can just drink some apple juice to make your blood sugar go up. There is no substitute for insulin. Exercise is a mild way to reduce your blood glucose, but it's not the same as insulin, and you can't exercise therapeutically like in the middle of the night when your blood glucose is rising. You can't wake up and run a marathon. So insulin is a life-saving necessary thing for type 1 diabetics. So let's talk about glucagon first. So we already said this. Potent hyperglycemic agent. It converts glycogen to glucose. It synthesizes glucose from lactic acid, and it causes the liver to release glucose. Man, this highlighting thing is kind of liking this. The release is triggered by humoral stimulus right here, falling blood glucose levels, fight or flight response, stress, sympathetic stimulation, and rising amino acid levels. That's kind of interesting. So this is one of the problems with really high protein diets. So, oh man, I don't want to get into this thing because I'll get hate mail either way. But we've got a lot of different diets going on. We have high protein diets, high carb diets, high fat diets. I'm not going to weigh in. I'm not in good enough shape to have a strong opinion, but I do understand the basic underlying, processes behind each. A high protein diet is not the end result will not be much different from a high carb diet, actually, which is surprising. So whether you're eating bread and pasta all the time or steak and eggs all the time, the end result is going to be gluconeogenesis. The exception to that would be a high fat diet, which is this whole ketogenic diet idea. Because if you maintain a high fat diet, you can maintain ketosis, which means that you are not producing glucose. You're actually utilizing ketones. I don't have a strong opinion on this, so I'm not supportive or, against that. Anytime you remove a macronutrient from your diet, I wonder if that's a good idea. But I don't know. I do know that refined sugar is very bad for you, so stay away from that. And I'll let you guys decide if you want to be vegan or keto or whatever. Let me know how it goes for you. Help me make up my mind. Insulin. Insulin is a hypoglycemic agent. That means it lowers blood glucose concentration. It doesn't like destroy glucose or anything like that. It just helps move it from your blood to skeletal and fat tissues. Thank goodness for this next bullet point, because you'd be dead in a hurry if you're a type 1 diabetic and this wasn't true. Insulin is not needed for glucose entry into the liver, kidneys, and brain. So you don't need to release insulin. So that's good because, say you haven't eaten for a while, you still want to have glucose available for your brain. Although if you haven't eaten for a while, you might notice you start to get a little grumpy. That's because maybe your glucose is a little bit low or whatever, and you're just hungry. Anyway, so it lowers blood glucose in 3 ways. Primarily, it enhances membrane transport of glucose, especially in muscle and fat. So that's just a fancy way of saying it increases the absorption of glucose by muscle and fat. It inhibits glycogen breakdown. This is kind of the idea of the best way to stop. Oh, what is that phrase? Goodness gracious. That's like the best way to stop digging a hole is to stop digging. I don't know. Forget it. Someone email me and tell me what this saying is. I'm gonna Google it. Stop digging, I guess, is basically the moral of the story. If you're finding yourself in a hole, so that's what this is here. It's inhibiting more glucose production in addition to causing glucose transport into muscle and fat. It also inhibits the conversion of amino acids and fat to glucose. Whoa, that's it. I do want to mention, I already mentioned insulin and glucose are antagonists. Okay, that's good for the quiz. I think I did an okay job of pointing out stuff that I think is important. Definitely know what all the hormones are and what their primary function is, and be able to differentiate between the 3 different types of stimuli: humoral, hormonal, and neural. The 2 different types of hormone categories, so amino acid based, lipid based, steroid hormones. And some of the differences of how that works, what type of pathway they use, second messenger versus direct gene activation, where the receptors are located on the plasma membrane versus in the cell, the way that hormones can interact with each other, permissiveness, antagonism, synergism, and some examples of each. And you should be good. I'm not 100% certain I'm even going to post a quiz because I'm posting this a little bit late. I'll let you know on Canvas, but for the final, that's definitely a good place to start on studying. All right, guys. Talk to you soon. Bye.